started. It's 9 o'clock. Thanks everybody for joining. Before we get started, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping procedures. This morning's webinar is being recorded and it will be up on our YouTube channel in the next day or so. Just as a note, all of our other webinars that we've hosted are now up on our YouTube page and can be accessed either directly through YouTube or on our website. It's on our homepage. If everyone can remain muted throughout the call, that would be wonderful, just so there isn't any background noise. However, if you do have questions that pop up throughout the presentation, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask Todd the questions directly. If anyone has any technical issues, please put those into the chat feature and I will do my best to help you through that. Just be aware that most of the issues stem from your own Wi-Fi connection. And finally, if anyone has dialed in via telephone today, please send me an email at mfrey@pjhq.com, and we'll make sure you get your MSR credits for this morning. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Ron Stepanek to make the introductions.
Thanks, Matt, and good morning, everyone. I am Ron Stepanek, a fellow PGA member and a business development executive for Brightview. Happy to be here to introduce today's program and Dr. Todd Bunnell. Todd has been with Brightview since 2012, and he currently serves as the Vice President of Agronomy for Brightview. And kind of give you a bit more background into Todd and what he does and his credentials. We talk a little bit about Brightview. You may be aware, Brightview is the industry leader at providing outsourcing services for golf course maintenance. So we're not a management company in any way, shape, or form. We focus exclusively on the golf course maintenance, growing grass, and making conditions as good as they can be. And we take great pride in this, and we've got incredible results. And it's very important for us to deliver the best product possible, because that's where we hold our entire reputation. We've been around for 40 years. We have 80 golf courses. And I want to be clear, we know we're not for everybody, but for courses that use us, we are proven to help make things better. And a key reason for that, among many, is Dr. Todd Bunnell. Todd is very well educated. He did his undergrad at University of Kentucky. He did his master's and his doctoral program at Clemson University, where he's got a PhD in plant physiology and turf grass. And he has done an extensive amount of research, and he's worked all across the country. And he's a tremendous asset to us and a great leader for the golf industry. So I'm happy to turn it over to Todd to talk about the top reasons for turf decline on Mid-Atlantic golf courses.
Thank you, Ron, and pleasure being with everyone this morning. Thank you for the opportunity. As Ron said, I am the agronomist for Brightview. I've been with the company now over 9 years. So up until COVID, I spent a lot of time on the road, actually visiting our properties. And that's a lot of fun for me. It's an opportunity to see a lot of different things. We have properties from California to Massachusetts and down into Florida and everywhere in between. So it's a great job to be able to go out and see our properties improve and try to make our superintendents better superintendents. So the content that we're going to talk about today is top reasons for turf decline on Mid-Atlantic golf course. And obviously, properties or golf courses, the end goal is to always have the turf grass in as good a condition as possible. And as we all know, Mother Nature happens, traffic happens, and so there's a variety of reasons why turf does decline. And I'll kind of talk you through kind of a high level process of what I go through when I'm trying to diagnose when there is an issue with the turf. And so like Matt said, if at any time you have any questions that you might want to ask, feel free to raise your hand and either chat the question and or unmute yourself and ask the question directly. I'd prefer to keep this as open as possible. And if any questions you have, anytime you have any questions, please don't hesitate. So really what we want to go over today is just provide a brief overview of turf basics and growth requirements. I'll try not to get too scientific, but at the same time, I think it's important to realize what are the critical things that turf and all plants for that matter need and require to grow at their best. And then we'll kind of talk about what are some of the top reasons for turf decline. And I'll try to focus primarily on cool season grasses because I know the majority of the golf courses in the Philadelphia area are cool season. For example, creeping bentgrass, Poa annual or annual bluegrass, perennial ryegrass, Kentucky bluegrass, those are considered cool season grasses, whereas the Bermuda grasses and zoysia grasses, those are considered more of your warm season turf grasses. And then we'll talk about, once you diagnose a problem or problems, because oftentimes it's not just one problem that's causing the reason for turf decline, but what are the options for turf improvement, both short-term and long-term? And then I'll just kind of capture some what I would consider emerging agronomic issues on mid-Atlantic golf courses and maybe some of those issues you have seen on your properties. So, this is obviously, what we're trying to achieve as the golf course maintenance provider, as a superintendent, is pristine conditions, good homogeneous type of turf grass cover where, the turf is healthy and growing and, you have an overall very good playing surface. I mean, this is what we strive for as golf course superintendents. However, at times things can go a little sideways, and these can be related to environmental, Mother Nature, and oftentimes in this bottom left-hand picture here, that is a man-made issue, and we'll certainly talk about those. Whenever you see turf and a turf issue and any sort of a linear or pattern type of appearance, that typically leads you to believe that it was something more human error involved, and so that's something to always keep in mind when you're looking at turf. Mother Nature does not create straight lines. So what are those basic turf grass requirements? And I kind of rank these in the order of importance. Obviously, number one is sunlight. That's what drives photosynthesis combined with water. And so I would say those are the top two general requirements of turf and any plant for that matter. Proper temperature, obviously we have no control over that from a standpoint of day-to-day lows and highs of temperature, but it is something to keep in mind when we are planning our general agronomic practices. Atmospheric CO2, that's actually very important for plants. They absorb carbon dioxide when combined with water and sunlight. That's the process of photosynthesis. And then they release oxygen in the air. Conversely, in the soil oxygen is very important. That's part of respiration of plants and root growth and root health. And so maintaining the right amount of soil oxygen is very important. And that is very closely related to the amount of water in the soil. And we'll briefly talk about that as well. Proper nutrition. Generally speaking, this is not a major issue on golf courses because, superintendents do have the ability to apply supplemental fertilizer when needed, but that's always something to keep in mind, especially when you get into situations where you may have a poor soil or your water quality is not very good. And then obviously there's some biological or non-biological factors. So the biological factors would be diseases or insects. More of your non-biological factors would be traffic, cart traffic, foot traffic, that sort of thing. That any one of these can impact, these requirements. And so, and really the thing to think about too is all of these requirements are very, very critical, especially when we're maintaining turf grasses at times less than an eighth of an inch. And so that makes these requirements that much more important when one of them is not being met at the critical level, that can really cause the plant to begin to decline. So we're really pushing the plant to grow at a very difficult level when we're maintaining it at such low mowing heights, combined with the amount of traffic that they're getting, especially this past year with COVID and the increases that we've seen in rounds. So real quick, we'll talk about sunlight. As we mentioned before, it's very important for turf grass growth and development. It is what drives photosynthesis. And so you see here, sunlight plus water plus carbon dioxide creates the carbohydrates that the plants need for growth, and then they release oxygen back into the atmosphere. Generally speaking, turf species do have a different daily sunlight demand. Warm season grasses require more sunlight compared to cool season grasses. So your Bermuda grasses and seashore paspalums, they require generally 5 to 8 hours of direct sunlight per day. Whereas your cool season grasses, which you all have predominantly in the Philadelphia area, they only require about 4 to 5 hours of direct sunlight. And then when you look at cool season grasses in general, Kentucky bluegrass requires the highest amount of sunlight, followed by perennial ryegrass and bentgrass. And then you can see annual bluegrass way down here. It requires the least amount. So for any of y'all who have putting greens that are in the shade, that's why those type of greens always generally have more POA or annual bluegrass than bentgrass, is because the annual bluegrass can grow better in a light limiting environment than creeping bentgrass can. And so obviously there's some other factors involved there as well, but generally speaking, annual bluegrass is the most shade tolerant of all of our cool season grasses. And so, these are situations that, we often see on putting greens, and we realize that obviously trees are a very important part of the aesthetic value and the overall feel of a golf course. But at times, there can be issues with not only the amount of sunlight that these trees are blocking, but also the air movement surrounding greens. And that becomes even more important, obviously, in the summer months with the air movement. So there are ways that you could selectively identify specific trees in these situations that would need to be removed, because the turf needs sunlight to be able to grow at its best. So now we'll talk about water. Obviously, water is a critical part of photosynthesis as well. It's important in also the movement of nutrients and sugar. And in those summer months in Philadelphia, it can get very warm and humid. It's a very important part of the plant's ability to cool itself. When we talk about water demands, warm season turf grasses use less water compared to cool season turf grasses. And that's just basically driven by their physiological structure of how they use water, and obviously they also don't use as much water to have to cool themselves because they're much more tolerant of warmer temperatures. And when we talk about water, and we'll talk about this more when we get more into the components of water, is that too much water in a soil obviously is not a benefit, especially at certain times of the year. And then water quality is very important as well. Water quality deals with the chemical components or chemical constituents of the water, your salt levels of your water, the amount of sodium or the amount of calcium that's in the water. Typically, we don't see a lot of water quality issues in the mid-Atlantic, but if you have golf courses that's on, for example, reclaimed water, oftentimes reclaimed water or recycled water can have some what I would call bad actors that can impact not only the turf growth, but also the health of the soil. Temperature, obviously plants have a specific range of temperature that is best for their growing environment. Cool season turf grasses generally prefer temperatures between 60 and 75 degrees. And so you get a day like we had yesterday, and it's almost like you can see the turf greening up throughout the day. And so those types of days is what I would call optimum for cool season grasses. There are some low temperature issues that we can come in with cool season grasses. Obviously, ice damage and or snow cover can cause some issues. But we do see winter kill on cool season grasses, and obviously in the heat of the summer, we can also see turf decline as well, because it is temperatures rise above the optimum temperatures for cool season grasses. And then warm season grasses, we won't spend a lot of time talking about those, but those do prefer it to be hotter. Bermuda grasses and seashore paspalums, they like the weather hot, and so the hotter the better for them. So atmospheric CO2, soil oxygen, and nutrition. Again, we don't have a lot of control over these with the exception of soil oxygen, and that is directly related to the health of the soil as well as the amount of water that's in the soil. And, you always hear people talk about proper drainage. Drainage is so important on a golf course, and that is very, very true, because if you have a waterlogged or saturated soil, that is going to significantly impact the amount of oxygen that's available in the soil. Because when you think about a soil, it's about, generally speaking, 50% solid matter and then 50% pore space. And so, oxygen can be a big, what I would call a healthy soil would be, of that 50% of the pore space, 25% would be water and 25% would be air. And so in that situation, there's ample of soil oxygen available to the plant or to the roots so that the plant can properly respire. When you get into situations of poorly drained soils or waterlogged soils, that amount of pore space, air-filled pore space, reduces significantly. And that's when you can really begin to get issues with rooting of turf grass, and that obviously is one of the most important factors of maintaining a healthy turf. And so when you hear people say drainage, that's a very, very important part of maintaining a healthy turf grass system, primarily because of that availability of soil oxygen in the root zone. Then we'll talk about nutrition very briefly, but nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, those are your primary essential nutrients. And I would say 99% of the time in the mid-Atlantic area, that is not going to be a limiting factor for turf grass. So now let's briefly talk about diagnosing some of these issues. And when we talk about trying to figure out what's wrong, if there's an area on the golf course that is not doing well, what I try to do is keep the basic turf requirements in mind. Keep it simple. Let's kind of go through these general requirements systematically to figure out which, if any, or all are limiting in a certain situation. And so the first one I always look at is sunlight. And so is there ample sunlight in this area where the turf is declining? And that can be done by just looking up at the tree canopy around and figuring out if there is a significant amount of shade that is on that area. Water, most frequently water quantity, but also water quality can impact turf and soil health. Temperature, obviously in the middle of the summer, temperature can be a limiting factor. But that is something to keep in mind, especially in areas that might not have the same amount of air movement across it. And, those areas would definitely have a higher potential for decline because, it's a much warmer, stagnant climate in that situation. Soil oxygen, poor soil oxygen, we talked about that before. Nutrition deficiencies or toxicities, typically not a big problem in the mid-Atlantic. And then pests, we'll talk about pests towards the end of the talk, but these can often impact the turf's ability to capture some of these type of requirements. And in other situations, such as diseases, they can actually have a lethal effect on the plant as well. And then other reasons, human influence. Unfortunately, there are situations where we shoot ourselves in the foot as golf course superintendents. Like I said, if you ever see, any type of a pattern approach or a pattern on turf, that's a good indication of some amount of human error. This is a situation here where post aerification, the mower height was too low and the area scalped, and so that's a scalping effect. So there are situations out there where we as superintendents do shoot ourselves in the foot. So when we talk about sunlight, and I did a lot of this work when I was in graduate school. The best way to evaluate sunlight is the amount of sunlight that's hitting an area in a given day. And what we're able to develop as turfgrass researchers is something called a daily light interval. And so basically what that measures is it quantifies the amount of sun that's hitting any given area, whether it's in full sun and or in partial shade or full shade. It gives a quantifiable number of, this is how much sun is hitting a given area on a given day, and that's measured in moles per day. And what we've been able to do as researchers is begin to develop light requirements for all these different grasses. And you can see the majority of these grasses on here are what I would call warm season grasses, but there are, some cool season grasses on here as well. So this is creeping bent grass maintained at putting green height. And you can see that kind of the critical number for bent grass is 30 moles of sunlight per day. And why is that important? Well, we have these light sensors that can be placed on any golf green or any area, and you can place that there over multiple days and begin to figure out how many moles of sunlight is hitting that area. So, for example, if we have an area that is not doing well on a creeping bent grass green, we could plant several of these light sensors in that area and then determine, are we getting more or less than 30 moles of sunlight per day? If we're getting less, then we know that we will not be successful long-term growing creeping bent grass in that area, simply because we're not providing the plant with enough sunlight to be able to grow at that height of cut. And you can see we also have the same number for perennial ryegrass. And obviously, the higher the height of cut, the better shade tolerance that plant is going to have, simply because the plant at a higher height of cut has more shoot area to be able to capture more sunlight. And so that's why you're going to see that you always have the highest light requirements at the lowest height of cut. And then you can see at the highest height of cut, you have the lowest light requirements. And then there's a lot of other factors that go into that as well. Obviously the plant being maintained at a lower height of cut is going to be more stressed, and it's going to have to require more energy to maintain itself at that height. But this is some really nice research that was developed back in the early 2000s and then further developed, where we're developing these light requirements for different turf grasses at different heights of cut. So this was the bent grass work. This was done at the University of Arkansas. So you can see here's a full sun day in Arkansas, and you can see the daily light interval is about 46 moles per day, and you can see that's very excellent quality of bent grass. But you can see when the daily light interval drops below 30, in this situation 28.4, you can start to see there's some turf decline. You're starting to get some algae development in there, and you're getting some thinning of the turf. And then if this were to happen over multiple years of having a tree or another structure overhanging a given area, you can see the amount of decline that would happen over a longer period of time. So this is some really neat research. I'm glad that they've been able to expand this over more turf grass species. And actually, I was on a webinar with Dr. Richardson, who was the one that presented this and has done this research on bent grass. And I said, for the Northeast, we really need to know what that number is for annual bluegrass, because there's a lot of golf courses in the Northeast that have predominantly annual bluegrass greens or have greens with a high percentage of annual bluegrass. And so I think that's definitely future research that we'll see in this area, is quantifying a daily light interval for annual bluegrass as well. This is typical Bermuda grass. This was actually my PhD work, and you can see that with Tiff Eagle. I apologize for the poor quality here, but this was developed back in the early 2000s. But you can see here's a full sun, 41 moles, and this was in Clemson. Here's 34 moles. This was right on the edge of acceptable quality. And then you can see what happens when you fall below that 32 mole threshold for Tiff Eagle, is that it just cannot sustain itself. So I guess the moral of this is that sunlight is a very, very important factor. And, we understand that trees are an important factor as well, but on golf courses. But, as trees continue to get larger on golf courses, the area of shadow that they cast is going to get larger and larger as well. So, I think some critical determination of any trees that do need to be trimmed and or removed because they are not providing adequate sunlight should be considered. So, steps to determine, we've kind of talked about a lot of these. The turf will be thin and weak. You can see algae. Oftentimes the turf will grow taller because it's searching for sunlight. And then that causes the turf to potentially be scalped and impact its growth. And then what you'd want to do is identify any trees that are facing east, south, and west, because that's primarily where the sun will be tracking throughout a daily cycle. There is some research that does show that morning sunlight on cool season grasses is more important. I think the majority of the photosynthesis that occurs in cool season grasses occurs in the early morning hours because the temperatures are cooler, especially in the summer months. And so also there's been some research to show that removing dew on turf in situations where you're not mowing every day, especially like on fairways, can help vector additional diseases. And so by allowing more sun on the turf in the morning hours, it can help that dew burn off quicker. So that's something else to keep in mind when we're identifying, potential trees that are, not allowing adequate sunlight. And it's important to visit those areas multiple times per day as well to see what and when those shadows are being cast over a given area. Then there are the tools. We mentioned the daily light interval, the light meter. That's the device that you can put on the turf to determine how many moles per day. And there's also several apps that'll kind of tell you where the sun will be at a given point in the day and whether or not a tree will be blocking those areas. But here's just some additional pictures. Here's those light sensors that you can see that are planted. And, these are really great tools. I highly recommend those if you do have an area that you feel is not receiving adequate sunlight. So what are your options? I think the first and easiest is to remove or thin out any trees that are causing shade. If obviously you can't remove all of them, but creating what I would call sun corridors to allow, full sunlight windows to allow sun to penetrate through. Growth regulators, we won't really talk about a lot about those. They're not a long-term fix, and they're typically part of a program anyway on a golf course putting green and or fairways. Establishment of more shade-tolerant turf grasses. Probably not a real good option for cool season. Obviously annual bluegrass is an option, but if you're trying to maintain creeping bent grass as your desirable, that natural succession will occur to annual bluegrass if the sunlight level is not increased. This isn't real applicable to the Mid-Atlantic, but I've always loved this picture. This was a golf course in Florida. Down at Amelia Island, and you can see this is a zoysia grass tee and heavy shade. And what we did here is we just put in some Bermuda grass sod to see how it would perform, and you can starkly see the difference in shade tolerance of these two turf grasses. So that there clearly is a difference with tolerance of shade between different turf grass species. So now let's talk about water. And, when we talk about water, I always say that, the separation of a good and a great superintendent is their ability to manage water. Especially in the mid-Atlantic where higher humidity levels can make water management that much more difficult. And so, when we're training our superintendents, we try to get our superintendents to be using the moisture meters to basically give you an instantaneous reading of what the moisture content is in the soil. And so, it's critically important is managing the right amount, not too wet or not too dry. That's a big part. And part of that is management of organic matter and or thatch. And, organic matter is a very critical point of managing water, because organic matter is important of holding some water, but too much organic matter can hold too much water. And so that's why we aerify, is to manage organic matter. That's why we top dress. That's why we use a sand top dressing to help dilute organic matter. So that's a very important part of managing water correctly, is also management of your organic matter. So, steps to determine when water quality is a problem. Obviously, in dry situations, you can see the turf begin to footprint. That's just because there's not enough water in the soil for the plant to be able to hold itself up. And then when any amount of traffic comes down upon the turf, it basically collapses. I'm sure everyone has seen this. This is what I would call that purpling effect of bent grass whenever that plant begins to get water stressed. So basically what's happening is the plant is shutting itself down because there's not enough water available to translocate up through the xylem to respire to cool itself. And so that's the typical purplish look that we get when the plant is becoming water stress. And then obviously this is a situation similar to the footprinting where, the rough area gets dry and then gets trampled by carts, and you can see that same sort of collapsing effect. Whereas on the flip side, if water or if the soil becomes too saturated, oftentimes we'll get these low-lying areas that begin to have surface algae. The turf is yellowish, it's weak. The main reason for that is that there's not ample amount of oxygen available in the soil. Oftentimes we get the development of this black layer, which is basically a chemical reaction of some typically iron and sulfide that creates this this black precipitate in the soil. Oftentimes it will have kind of a rotten, eggy smell, but that's something that is very indicative of a poorly drained soil. Also, when you have excessive soil moisture, you can also have a better environment for certain diseases and certain weeds as well. Here's some nutsedge that's a good indicator of a poorly drained soil. So really, there's two different levels here, or two different spectrums. There's too dry or too wet in certain situations. So what are the tools to help manage water? Whenever we come onto a new golf course, I always urge the superintendents, don't assume that the irrigation system is running the right way. And so what we try to do is we do an irrigation audit where we'll put out rain gauges. We'll make sure that the system is programmed correctly. But assuming that the irrigation is delivering the right amount of water over a given area is not the best assumption, because typically you will have variances in the distribution and the uniformity of water with any irrigation system. And so that's something that always needs to be checked. Soil moisture meters, we mentioned this before. This is a pogo meter. Basically, it connects to your phone and it gives you an instantaneous reading of the amount of moisture that's in the soil. A good superintendent will have a threshold level on any given green that, whenever they know that they're going to go below that threshold, that they need to apply water or the turf will stress. So typically during the summer months, you will see superintendents or other golf course maintenance staff members out there in the morning hours checking greens with these devices. And this will tell them how much water, if any, that they need to apply to that area on any given day to make sure that it gets through the day without fallen below that critical level. So this is a newer technology and really groundbreaking technology that's helped us as superintendents manage water much more effectively. Here's another meter. This is the Tdr meter. Slightly different technology, but it still does the same thing. You can see that this is a drier area and it's only reading at 9% soil moisture. So I would say, generally speaking, a target moisture level by percent moisture is anywhere from the mid to upper teens into the low 20s is typically what I would consider an average percent moisture content that in most situations would be adequate. And so if you had this situation where you had a 9% level, you would obviously want to get out and get some water on that as soon as possible. So when we talk about management of moisture, I think it's important to talk about thatch or organic matter, especially when you're dealing with creeping bentgrass, which creeping bentgrass is historically a very inherent turf grass that can develop thatch over time if not managed properly. And this was from a sand-based tee of a golf course in Delaware, and you can see all these layers of different organic matter. Basically, in this situation, there had been a lot of heavy top dressings applied over this area, but not enough core aerification to really dilute that. When you get into a situation like that, the water doesn't readily penetrate through this thatch level. And so what you'll get a very dry soil underneath and a very wet amount of moisture contained in this organic matter region. And so in this type situation, when it gets extremely hot, you're not able to get water to penetrate down into the root system. The water stays up in this area up here, and then you can really start to see some turf decline. And that's what you're seeing here. All these areas are getting very dry. This is what we call localized dry spot because the water is just not penetrating down through this organic matter. And we realize as superintendents that aerification is a disruption to the golf course, but in many situations it's a critical piece of helping manage organic matter and helping us manage water correctly. So management of organic matter, there's many ways to help manage it. Top dressing, this is vertical mowing with sand channeling created, but basically managing organic matter by diluting and or extracting out organic matter is a critical part of maintaining soil moisture. This is a new system here. This is called a dry jet. I don't know if any of you all have performed this on any of your golf courses, but it's a newer type of technology, very non-disruptive, creates these sand channels. It is rather expensive, but it is a good way to help create sand channels that can help penetrate or allow water to move down through these thatch layers. It does require the use of dry sand, which increases the cost of this process. And then obviously you have to hire the contractor to come out and perform this. But it is another tool that we have as golf course superintendents to help not only manage organic matter, but manage moisture as well. I don't want to spend a lot of time on water quality, but basically a good superintendent will have a very good grasp of his or her salt, pH, bicarbonate, sodium levels. Not typically a problem in the mid-Atlantic unless we're dealing with a reclaimed or recycled water situation. And then obviously temperature, both high temperatures and low temperatures. This was the winter of 2013. This was a golf course in Detroit, Michigan. Basically, these greens were under ice for over 90 days. And, in that type of situation where you're under ice, the soil becomes anoxic. And, in many situations, annual bluegrass in particular will die, due to significant ice cover. And then on the flip side, you have, I'm sure many of you all have seen fans that are used in extreme temperatures to help lower the temperature in the canopy. and by simply moving air across the canopy surface to reduce humidity and to cool the plant. Again, this is greatly out of our control, but there are some general tools that we can use to help manage temperature extremes. You know, I think back to last summer, and obviously there were some pretty high significant rainfall events combined with what I would call extreme heat and humidity following. And so in these type situations, typically in our native soil areas like our fairways, we can see a significant amount of turf decline. And, you know, whether it's wet wilt or just overall temperature stress in these type situations, you know, we just high temperature associated with high amount of soil moisture is a recipe for turf decline, especially if you have a fairway with any amount of annual bluegrass on them. So this is a common theme that we see on fairways that have annual bluegrass, is that the annual bluegrass just is not able to tolerate that level of temperature combined with, you know, pretty much a waterlogged soil situation. And then, you know, we can invite in other issues such as Pythium, and then combine that with traffic from carts, and it's not a good situation on many fairways. So atmospheric carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nutrition. Again, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but you know, soil oxygen, you know, we mentioned how important that is in relation to the overall health of the turf grass root system. So now let's kind of shift gears and talk more about biotic factors. So you know, the first ones to consider are diseases. You know, unfortunately, we do have to manage many diseases in cool season grasses. You know, not only in the summer months, but also, you know, in the fall and spring and coming out of winter as well with snow mold. The one thing to keep in mind is that a healthy turf is going to be your best defense against turf grass diseases, and typically that's why we don't see as many disease issues until we get late into the summer months on a healthy turf grass stand. We do have several control products, many fungicides that are available to superintendents, but oftentimes when disease pressure gets to a certain level, those fungicides just aren't able to provide enough protection against the plant because the disease pressure is so high. Probably the predominant diseases that we're dealing with on cool season grass in the mid-Atlantic are Pythium, dollar spot, summer patch, and anthracnose. These are what I would consider all more you know, summertime diseases, with the exception of dollar spot. Dollar spot can occur pretty much year round. Dollar spot is fairly easier managed with fungicides and nutrition. But some of these other ones like Pythium, summer patch, or anthracnose, they can be much more damaging on a short-term basis, as opposed to dollar spot is pretty much always going to be there. That pressure will always be there. But like I said, fungicides are effective against most of these diseases if applied at the right timing and applied in the right area, whether it's a foliar application or a root application. Insects, probably the big insect that everyone in the mid-Atlantic area is aware of is the annual bluegrass weevil. This is the larvae from the annual bluegrass weevil. Can be a major pest to annual bluegrass, especially in collars and greens perimeters, step cuts in fairways, into fairways. The problem with annual bluegrass weevil is that we don't have a lot of good insecticides to control the adult. If we can control the adult, then we can stop the laying of the eggs and the development of these larvae, which is what causes the majority of the damage. And there's a couple products that do control the adult. One is dealing with significant resistance, and so that basically that product or insecticide has been used so much over many years that the adult annual bluegrass weevil has become resistant to it. And the other product that is very effective is having some regulatory issues with EPA and will likely lose registration in the next coming years. And so this is really a pest that we need to have some alternate control measures for to control the adult, so that we can prevent the development and formation of the larvae, which are the damaging part of this insect's life cycle. White grubs, animal damage, is typically an issue in late summer, early fall. Frankly, we've seen more damage on our golf courses from animal damage, looking basically skunks and raccoons and foxes digging up turf areas looking for grubs than we have actual damage from the white grubs. That's always a concern into the late summer, early fall months. But we've seen more issues with animal damage, specifically in rough areas where these animals will come in and dig these areas up, searching for the grubs as a food source. The crane fly, the European and common crane fly, is becoming more and more of an issue. Typically, we see these flying around both in the spring and late summer, early fall, and this is the damaging part of the insect. The crane fly looks like a mosquito, so you'll see it flying around the surface of the grass, typically twice per year in the spring and the late summer, early fall. And what they're doing is they're laying the eggs of these larvae, what they call them leather jackets, and these are the damaging part of this insect's life cycle that impact the turf. Basically, you go in and feed on the underground system of the turf, and so this is an emerging issue that we're seeing. But fortunately, we are able to find some insecticides that can be effective against these larvae. Human influences, cart, foot, or mower traffic. This is a very frequent thing that we see is the cleanup pass damage on turf, especially during periods of high rainfall, because that area, that soil is becoming more and more saturated. That continual tracking of that mower over that area can cause turf decline. Obviously, with COVID, with single rider restrictions on golf courses, we've seen a huge amount of traffic come across golf courses with higher rounds. Combine that with, and we've really seen a significant impact of the increased traffic from carts impact the overall health of the turf. And so, as we look forward into 2021 with the season upon us, traffic management is very, very important to help manage through that increased traffic from the carts. Also, we do see damage from mowers, scalping. This situation here, you can see some scalp turf. So unfortunately, there are some human-induced stresses that can occur on turf. And, superintendents, we just need to manage that traffic as best as we can. Like I said before, any variation in turf quality or health that you see in any type of a pattern or linear type of appearance generally lends to some sort of human error. Like I said, Mother Nature does not make lines. So now let's kind of talk about some emerging problems on Mid-Atlantic golf courses, and we'll start with weeds. Whenever you get any amount of stress on the turf, you bring up voids that allows, an invitation to or for any weeds to become established. And we saw this last year with the extreme stress that we had on fairways. I think last year was a very difficult weed year for many superintendents in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. I think that was, several factors were involved there. Obviously, the increased cart traffic, provided some additional stresses to the plant. And then just the weather that we had last year with the amount of high temperature and rainfall events. I know there was the tropical system that came up through that area, dropped a lot of rain following, high temperature and humidity. And so, whenever you have a stressed plant, that creates an opportunity for weeds to become established. And, we're seeing more and more goose grasses, sedges, and crabgrass. These remain problematic and difficult to control. Some emerging weeds are Kalinga. Kalinga is a type of sedge, and you can see it's got kind of a limier green look. It often has a much higher growth habit than our bent grasses or poas or ryegrasses, and so you will see it start to grow and get taller 1 to 2 days following a mowing event. And so that's becoming more and more of a problem. It is controllable, but the problem is some of these patches can be quite large. And so what we recommend is predominantly fall applications so that we can come back in with some seed in these areas to get the predominant or desirable turf grass reestablished in those areas. We are seeing some more and more what I would call perennialized grassy weeds. This is bull or thin paspalum. Very similar to what another paspalum species, Dallas grass, but these are becoming more and more prevalent in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic as well. There are herbicides that can control all of these weeds, but they're very, very selective to a specific weed. And obviously we don't want to be, as superintendents, spraying a herbicide on turf in the middle of the summer is not always a welcoming proposition. And so for some of these weeds, pre-emergent herbicides are effective, but not for all of them. So we are seeing increased weed pressure on golf courses in the Mid-Atlantic, and combine that with the amount of stress that occurred in 2020 with the increased car traffic, and that is something to keep your eye on. Also, diseases. Nematodes is not technically a disease, but it's often classified in the disease category. A nematode is a small plant parasitic worm that feeds on turf roots. And frankly, we're seeing more and more nematode pressure in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. The only way that you will really be able to determine if you have a nematode problem is through a nematode assay. And we recommend all of our golf courses do nematode assays this time of the year, probably more in the April-May timeframe, to determine if there are any nematodes that are causing problems. Because typically, nematodes are not going to be the primary reason why turf would decline or die. But if it's another factor that's contributing to some additional stress to that plant, then if we can eliminate one of those factors, then that's going to help us be more successful and more healthy once we get into the summer stress period. So it's something that I would recommend any golf course in the Mid-Atlantic to do. Go to a couple putting greens, maybe 3 or 4 greens, take some samples of soil, send them off to either Rutgers or Penn State, whichever lab, and just run some nematode assays and see if you have populations that are at a level high enough that will warrant a control application. Gray leaf spot is obviously, I wouldn't say it's an emerging issue, but it's an ever-present issue if you have ryegrass on your fairways. We typically see this in the late summer, early fall, and this is coupled with humidity and rainfall. Typically, these spores are brought up from the south, and can be highly damaging to fairways. I mean, I've seen fairways be taken out over a period of a few days with a high gray leaf spot infestation. Pythium, we're seeing, unfortunately become more and more of an issue. Both foliar and root pythium. Probably the most damaging on putting greens is the root pythiums. I would say the foliar pythiums are more damaging on fairways, simply because we don't have the ability to drain as well on fairways, and so that's why we have a higher potential for foliar pythium, whereas in root pythium, we typically see these on putting greens more. But, these are extremely damaging. These typically are combined with high heat and humidity following a rainfall event. So we do have some control fungicides for these. However, they're very expensive and need to be timed appropriately to control the pythium prior to its development. So I think that about wraps up. Yeah, I think that's about the right time. But, basically, I just want to stress that, as an agronomist, what are some of the things that I do is, I try to determine if the turf is receiving it or receiving the adequate requirements that it needs for healthy growth: sunlight, proper water, proper temperature, proper nutrition. And, unfortunately, biological and/or human factors can also play a significant role in that. And so, as I'm diagnosing these things, I try to keep it simple and to identify which requirements are being met or not being met, and then develop a plan or path forward to help mitigate any of those issues and make sure that some of those requirements will be met in order to improve the situation. So that's all I have formally. If there's any questions or comments, I'd be happy to take those at this time.
Todd, I know you touched on it a little bit, but have you guys noticed with the summers getting seemingly more hot and humid in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic area that some courses are considering, particularly in the southern portions of the region, considering changing some of their grasses over to more kind of the temperate zone or warm season grasses?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, there's definitely a trend in moving that direction. And I've seen a lot of golf courses start with doing a section of their driving range tee on that as a way to kind of see how it would perform. Probably the most limiting factor, Matt, to switching to a cool season or a warm season grass, such as Bermuda grass. Zoysia grass could be considered as well, but zoysia grass is very expensive to install. Is sunlight. And, a lot of the courses in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, have a lot of trees. And, like I mentioned before, Bermuda grass requires a significant amount more sunlight than does bent grass or perennial ryegrass. And so that would have to be evaluated closely before making that decision to move to Bermuda grass.
Right.
Would be the amount of sun that would be available. But definitely, and the good thing about the Bermuda grasses is that, they could be they could be established slowly over time, as you could maybe develop a seeding program where you slowly convert it over time. Another way would be to shut down the golf course and sprig the Bermuda grass, but that would obviously result in a golf course closure. But yeah, there definitely has been some shift, I would say, more in the Virginia area towards Bermuda grasses. We actually maintained one of the golf courses in the Williamsburg area, and they had Bermuda grass on those fairways as well. And we actually did a converted those fairways to one of the newer Bermuda grasses. There's the Latitudes, the North Bridges. So there's a lot of very good Bermuda grasses that are inherently tolerant of the colder weather that you would endure in the Mid-Atlantic, that I think, should be strongly considered. And it all goes back to when you want the golf course to play its best. If the majority of your tournaments are in the summer months and you want to have great, firm, fast conditions in the summer, then Bermuda grass might be a great option. But if you're more of a spring and fall type golf course, where the majority of your tournaments and member play are, in the May, June, and then Labor Day thereafter time frame, then maybe you want to stick more to the cool season. So I think that plays an important role as well.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions? No? All right. Well, I appreciate everyone jumping on, and Todd and Ron, thank you very much for your time. That was a lot of great information. Really do appreciate you and your partnership. There's some contact information for the fellas if any one of your facilities are interested in learning more about Brightview, feel free to contact them. And as I mentioned, this webinar will be up on YouTube shortly.
Okay, well, I appreciate the opportunity, and yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any questions about agronomics or our services as well. So,
thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity, and everyone have a great week.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Okay.